I'm the Director of Imaging Services at the Northeast Document Conservation Center. That's in Andover, Massachusetts. Little bit of background, the Northeast Document Conservation Center is the largest book, paper, and photograph conservation center. It's also the oldest in the US. We primarily do conservation work on historic medias, whether they be book or paper or photographs, as I just said. But anything having to do with electronics is kind of new at the center. We had a reprographics division that did microfilm for years. We shut all that down years ago when they made the decision that microfilm wasn't really the best way to provide copies of things going forward. They started a small digitization effort maybe 5-6 years ago, which now is very well established and something of a model for others. So with that background, let me tell you about the IRENE project, the NEDCC IRENE project. As a little bit of history, IMLS approached us, I guess just about 2 years ago now, and inquired whether we'd be interested in getting involved in the IRENE process, or the IRENE project, which Dr. Carl Haber at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory had been working on for about a decade. And some of us at the center knew what that was all about, and were really rather excited by it, even though it was an entirely new area for us. We are not audio experts. We don't know audio much at all, other than what some of us maybe grew up with or had as hobbies. But what we are is very good at object handling. We understand how to work with materials that are fragile, how to respect them, and when not to touch them, so to speak, when it's better to back away and do nothing rather than do something that might harm them. So we also have a really strong production ethic, if you will, where we respect the dollar that goes into producing everything that we do, and we know that there's not enough money to go around, so we really try our best, and our staff definitely tries their best to stretch it as far as we possibly can. And IMLS knows that because they've given us money for decades. So we were a pretty good fit from their perspective for a place to put this audio effort, which really in its core is not audio, it's imaging. Because the IRENE process uses photography in weird ways, but it uses photography to capture without touching the object, capture audio without touching the object. So it really takes a good sensibility for imaging science to make this fly, less so on the audio side. And let me explain that just a bit too. As preservationists, we don't care how pretty the audio sounds. That's not our job. Our job is to faithfully capture what's there and leave it to somebody else to turn it into a derivative or some sort of packaged product that is pretty to listen to. This goes long back into history of imaging, where 20 or 30 years ago, if we had molested photographs digitally to make them prettier or nicer, by today's standards, we would have destroyed them. And all that archival work that we thought we would have been doing back then would have been wasted because imaging science has advanced so much over the course of that time. So, and the same rules apply in audio. What we have available to us today in audio restoration tools is far better than it was 5 or 10 years ago, and they will look primitive compared to what we have 10 or 20 years from now. So our job is to capture in as raw and as pure a state as we can the audio and turn it over to the archives to do with what they want. There's a second reason we do that, and that is any time that we would spend doing that, would cut back the amount of work that we could possibly recover for clients. And there's more work than we can save. So, the initial grant period for this process began in March of 2013. That's when we signed the papers and everybody made the announcements and we said we're going to do this. It was at that point that we started talking to Dr. Haber at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory about, okay, when can we have it? He said, but wait, we really want to make a couple of final tweaks to IRENE before we really put the stamp on it and say it's a done product, and we're ready to call it the final version. We were fine with that. He, of course, described in terms we could understand exactly what he was interested in changing, and it sounded wonderful, in fact. And as a result, we have the most advanced IRENE system out there, the only one that's this advanced, we didn't get it till the end of the year, which is way behind our project schedule. So we were fortunate enough to be able to go back to IMLS, Institute for Museum and Library Services, and say we need a little more time in this grant because we had some delays in developing out the final version of IRENE. And so they did. They gave us an extension and a few more dollars to tide us through August of 14, which we're fast approaching now. And the good news is, from what we said we would do in the initial project specifications, we're pretty much on schedule now to do that. So, got ahead of myself here. Okay, so the team is NEDCC as the lead player in this effort. We work very closely with Dr. Carl Haber at Lawrence Berkeley and his team. In fact, there's a picture of IRENE later on in the presentation, and you'll see a phone sitting off to the side of it. That's almost the hotline to his office. How do we do this? It's every day we're on the phone to them. Also, Dr. Earl Cornell. I don't want to say that he's not every bit as important as Dr. Haber is. Dr. Haber works primarily with the hardware, and Dr. Cornell on the software. So the two complement each other beautifully, and they're both wonderful people to work with. Library of Congress has been a contributor to this. They did a lot of the early development on IRENE, or not so much development, but early testing and use. So we've been able to work with them to say, okay, what is this? How do we do this? What was your experience with this? To some degree, what they've done is just background for us because the systems are significantly different than what they have. But it's still wonderful to be able to lean on them for advice and counsel as we go on. It's really sort of the same thing, but they're not. The National Audiovisual Conservation Center in Culpeper, Virginia, which is an arm of the Library of Congress. So there are IRENE systems in both those locations. One is a 2D system, I'll explain that later. One is a 3D system. They do not have both capabilities in either of those locations. So to some degree, they're a little bit hampered by that. And there's some other technical differences between the systems. So anyway, with that as a preliminary, why are we doing this? Why go through all of this trouble to invent and put into service this very high-tech method of looking at audio? And that's kind of a funny term, but looking at audio. And it all started really back in 2008 with this survey it's a preservation survey that Indiana University, Bloomington did, which took a look at their audio holdings and came up with some pretty frightening conclusions. This is one quote from their executive summary. And it says, "This survey reveals that large portions of Indiana University Bloomington holdings are seriously endangered due to inadequate storage, degradation of the media, and format obsolescence." Now, they weren't doing things really badly. They were doing things the way everybody else is doing them. And what was going on was all of this early audio media was degrading at a really fast clip, faster really than most people were aware of or expected to have to deal with. So that, let me give you one more quote, okay? Many archivists believe that there is a 15 to 20 year window of opportunity to digitize existing analog audio and video before degradation and obsolescence make these efforts impossible or too expensive. Remember, this is 2008, all right? So a number of the people that were involved in this work to figure all this out then became involved in the creation of the National Recording Preservation Plan, which was issued in 2012, okay? Which looked at the Bloomington study, looked nationally at things going on, looked at the Library of Congress holdings and others, and summarized this. Most of the nation's audio collections are stored under conditions that contribute to their deterioration. Many endangered analog formats must be digitized within the next, again, 15 to 20 years before further degradation makes preservation efforts all but impossible. Almost the same language as the Bloomington study, only we're, 6 years later? So really back these numbers off 5 years, something like that. So you don't have 15 to 20 years. You maybe have 15 years to do this. Okay, so with that as a background, what is the project? What were we asked to do? We were asked to bring Carl Haber's IRENE technology out of the laboratory. It had been about a decade in development. It worked, okay, but it was in places, the 3 machines that were in existence were in research environments where you really didn't have access to them unless it was something really, really special. And Dr. Haber could find time among his other jobs, and this is not his primary job, but where his team could find time to actually devote to whatever it is that they were working on, recovering audio, and they don't have a lot of time to do it. And the 2 systems that are in the Library of Congress and the National Audiovisual Conservation Center also had limited amounts of time available on them, and I don't think any of you would have had access to them anyway, because they have their own collections to deal with. So we were asked if we would be that available system, if we could put together an audio program and make it available to anyone who needed it. We were also asked, this is sort of the other side of it, we were asked to build a sustainable business model that would help fund Dr. Haber's research and development into furthering IRENE. Even though it's been a decade in development, it's not 100%. It never will be. No science ever is. No technology ever is. He can keep making it better, faster, less expensive, hopefully. We all know that these things can be done, but you're limited by the technology available to you at any given time. And like I said, it just keeps getting better. So our task here was find a way to generate enough funding outside of grants that would keep him in business, that would keep him able to further the development of this and maybe some other processes, who knows. So we took that challenge on. We were also asked to build a production scale facility in Andover to do this. That's no small task. There's a fair amount of money involved there. We have studies going on right now to try and figure out what all that means. How far do we take this? What do we do? But we made the commitment that if we were going to take IRENE on, we would build a production facility for this. And the last thing, and really the only one that matters, is we made a commitment to save as much of our audio heritage as we could, given the limitations of what we have to work with. Just as we've done with paper objects all these years, we're making the same commitment, or we have made the same commitment for grooved audio. So, enough talking. This is what we're trying to save, media that may look like this. There's no chance that you're going to stick that on a phonograph and get anything out of that at all. Okay? And you probably don't know what, does anybody know what this is? Has anybody seen this before? Cool. All right, good. I don't know if you can read that, the inscription on there, but you can see the grooves in the upper left corner. All right? I can't make it entirely out, but what I can see says, made April 15th, 1885 by AGB to test. All right, and it's CAB also, I didn't put that in my notes, but AGB and CAB to test. That's Alexander Graham Bell. Okay, so CAB is his audio engineer.
Is that wax?
That is wax on some sort of a paper. Here you go. Wait a minute. It jumped on me. Here we go. Did you hear that okay back there? Because we're doing a funky little thing here with the microphone to get the sound. We should have had speakers, but we don't. But I thought it came out fairly clear. That came from those grooves from 1885 that were thoroughly unplayable by any other method. And that is the only known recording of his voice. That's right.
And what did he say?
Hear my voice, Alexander Graham Bell.
And is that cleaned up? Or
That's cleaned up, yeah. That's cleaned up. I actually have a version of it here that's not as clean. Okay, so I did the cleaned up version for you, but that raw version is actually what's published. That's what's out there. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go to an 11-minute video that's just a wonderful piece done by KQED San Francisco, and they've given us permission to use this. So here goes.
The following KQED production was produced in high definition.
Think for a moment about what brings you pleasure. Food? Nature? If you got music, you're definitely not alone. Music is an essential part of human life in almost every global culture, but the ability to record sound is a surprisingly recent development.
People say that Edison was the first person to do that. Actually, sound was recorded in 1859, which is almost 20 years before Edison did it, by a man called Leon Scott. And he built a recorder, which he called the phonoautograph.
Frenchman Leon Scott's revolutionary invention worked by scratching sound waves into a long strip of paper covered with a sooty powder called lampblack. But it had one major drawback.
He had no way of playing these things back. In 1877, Edison invented the reproduction of sound. He used the stylus to really emboss the amplitude and frequency into a strip of tinfoil, which is wrapped around the cylinder. As the cylinder rotated, the needle moved up and down and created deeper or shallower impacts into the foil. Then he was able to spin the foil again and let the needle be driven up and down by these
Haber's personal interest in music and sound and his skills as a physicist converged one day in 2000.
I happened to hear a radio broadcast on KQED about the Library of Congress and its collection of sound recordings in many cases, or some cases they were damaged or delicate or at risk.
Haber had a flash of inspiration. He realized he might be able to use his expertise in sensitive optical measurement technology to solve the problem. He set to work, and by 2005, Haber's team had demonstrated a working prototype of their machine at the Library of Congress. It was called IRENE, short for Image Reconstruct Erase Noise, etc. The system was capable of taking microscopic pictures of the grooves in old, damaged records, and then playing them back clearly without ever touching them. So, how is it possible to play a record without touching it? Well, to understand, you should start with a basic grasp of how sound works.
Sound is a sensation that we experience through our ears, which respond to compressions and rarifications of the atmosphere around us. And the mechanism of hearing transforms the movement of our eardrum into impulses in our brains that we've learned to recognize as sound.
When an object causes an excitation, say a hammer hits a bell, the vibrations cause regular fluctuations in air pressure, creating peaks of high pressure called compressions, followed by valleys of low pressure called rarefactions. If you could see them, they'd look something like waves in a pool.
Amplitude refers to the magnitude, if you like, of these compressions and rarifications, what we normally associate with the loudness of the sound.
By the turn of the 20th century, Edison's method of inscribing these peaks and valleys onto the surface of a cylinder had taken the world by storm. For the first time, anyone could capture and play back sound. For anthropologists like Alfred Kroeber, it would mark the beginning of an era. Kroeber was a professor of anthropology and the director of what was then the University of California Museum of Anthropology, now called the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology. Kroeber's focus became the indigenous tribes of Northern California, and he specialized in the Yurok family of languages. One of his primary research and preservation tools was the wax cylinder recorder.
You had to take the cylinder, the recording machine, and you had to take a few crates of cylinders. And Kroeber would take the train from San Francisco to, I think, Eureka. And then they would take the stagecoach up a little bit further north, and then they would load the stuff on mules and go overland to the Yurok territory. And then they would set up their equipment in the field.
During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Kroeber and his associates recorded hundreds of 3-minute cylinders of Yurok speech, songs, and stories. The collection is an anthropological gem still housed in Berkeley's Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology. And for many people, the crown jewels of the collection are the recordings of Ishi.
Ishi was an Indian who had lived entirely outside of white communities at the time when he kind of burst onto the scene in 1910. One day he was encountered by some white people up in the Sierra foothills. No one could communicate with him. They called him wild, and they brought him back to San Francisco. He had this very, very thorough and complicated knowledge of traditional culture, including traditional physical practices and cultural practices, and also traditional stories. And some of what survives about Ishi is the stories that he told, which were recorded on my cylinder.
The Ishi cylinders have been a source of careful study since his death in 1916, but like so many of the recordings in the Hearst collection, the Library of Congress, and elsewhere, the cylinders are deteriorating, and not just from overuse.
Unfortunately, there's a mold which attacks a fungus, which attacks the wax and actually eats it. And when it does that, it completely destroys the information. So this is a particularly bad case. You can see all this splotchiness.
Haber and his team had already shown with IRENE that they could restore old grooved records using a 2-dimensional optical scanning technique. easy because the waves are visible in 2 dimensions. Wax cylinders would present a whole new challenge.
Edison's modulation was actually vertical, up and down. Photography is not a good way to measure depth.
Haber's team would need a different technology if they were to scan and restore the cylinders. They settled on a technology called confocal microscopy.
What confocal microscopy does is it trades off spatial information for depth. Imagine you're flying over the countryside in an airplane and you're essentially sending something down to the ground, which then bounces back to you, some sort of a signal. And you get information about the spot directly below you, and then the plane or the helicopter moves, and you cover the landscape in this way.
It was a technology with potential, but would it work with wax cylinders? This is where Andrew Garrett and the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum's collection come in.
We picked 12 cylinders out of the Hearst collection that were interesting for intrinsic and incidental reasons. They included somewhat of a variety of physical conditions. There were a couple of cylinders of Ishii, and there was one cylinder of a local language from the Bay Area.
The priceless cylinders were mounted on a specially designed spindle in Haber's lab. From here, the confocal microscope would take sequential measurements of the depth of the grooves, extracting an image of the sound captured in them. For Garrett, the results were amazing.
I've listened carefully to some of the snippets that have been analyzed. It's a miracle that there's anything, right? So every time I open it up and listen to it, I have to remind myself that this is audio that comes out of a photograph, and that really is just miraculous.
It's an incredible accomplishment, but Haber is the first to point out that the technology still has a way to go.
This is a very much a work in progress, and we're fortunately riding on all the incredible improvements in scanning technology, speed of computers, speed of cameras, data storage.
And they'll need that speed. Haber's team has already restored recordings from Ishii to Jack London, and music from Enrico Caruso to early Les Paul. But there are more than 9 million groove format recordings in American collections alone. So it's only now becoming clear just how huge an impact his team of hobbyist scientists may have on American cultural history.
What this experience has taught me is that scientists are really interesting people, and you work on particle accelerators or whatever, and you're trained to apply those skills to that, and you're interested in old music, and somehow just serendipitously you put those interests together and you come up with this completely new creative thing. I just think it's wonderful.
You can make Quest even better. Take a short online survey for a chance to win a $50 gift certificate to Amazon at kqed.org/quest.
It's really hard to follow that. The estimates of how much material is out there to be saved keeps changing. I don't think any of us really have a clue how much there is, but what we do know is it's failing every day. It's especially the wax cylinders. They are very susceptible to, well, first to the mold, which destroys them, but also to climate changes. If you move them from high to low humidity or high to low temperature, very often they simply implode. They're gone. Irene may have a capability in the future to recover sound from completely destroyed discs as well, but as was mentioned earlier, the longer we wait, the more expensive it gets because the harder it's going to be to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's really a race against time. This is a photograph that was given to us, if you will, by the Edison Historic Site. I'll say more about them in a little bit, but this is Edison's recording studio from roughly the turn of the century. And much of the commercial recording that was done in the very, very early days was done in this room. So that's That's pretty interesting. And there's also a little piece. In the nature of saving time, I haven't put all of these clips in their entirety because we'd be here all afternoon, which would be fine by me, but I think you have other things to do. Then we move forward a few decades. And remember, this is just a few decades difference in time. And this comes out of the Carnegie Hall collections. We have a number of contributors of rare and either unknown or important materials to this project that are a part of the work that we're doing. This one comes from 16-inch instantaneous lacquers that Carnegie Hall has in their collections. And enough to go around. What time frame do you think that is? Right after World War II. Enough to go around. Very curiously, that is 100 Brickstone Square in Andover, Massachusetts, which had as its first use a woolen mill. So it's very possible that that recording had something to do with that mill in Massachusetts. There were plenty of wool mills in Massachusetts, but that was a wool mill. So that's when we found that was, whoa, something strange. Another contributor to our project is Middlebury College in Vermont, which has the Helen Hartness Flanders Folklife Collection. They're the custodians of that. This is New England folk music from roughly the 1930s to the 1960s, which is when Helen Hartness Flanders went out into the field and recorded these folk singers in their own home environments with whatever the equipment was available in the day. Much of the early work was done on wax cylinders, not the normal 4-inch ones that you would know if you know wax cylinders, which are the commercial versions, but the 6-inch ones, which were the field recorded or the one-off recorded versions of these cylinders. So she would trek all this stuff out there, record in these people's homes or fields or wherever, and it's a priceless collection of New England balladry that is in danger. It was transcribed in the early 1970s, or at least part of it was, most of it was, by the Library of Congress using what was available at the time, which was relatively crude audio equipment for doing this. They did it to tape. Now curiously, the tape is failing. That's a whole other subject. But the tape is wearing out. The cylinders are more or less still intact. So as a part of our grant project, we took on the task of digitizing as many of these cylinders as we could. We've done about 250 of them so far. We've got almost all of the intact cylinders done. What we have to deal with now are the ones that are broken. For that, we need some input from objects conservators, and we just need a little more comfort before we tackle that project. But here is a cute little piece of audio. I didn't have the heart to cut her off midstream. That is actually her image. So,
Let me ask
yes, please.
you, this is straight from the wax cylinder to Irene, and what other medium does it go through to get to the?
That's right.
Just it?
That's right. A little bit of noise cleanup, and that's all. This is straight out of Irene, and this is some of the work that we have done. Irene is an amazing tool. In terms of audio fidelity, it captures from 0 hertz to 90,000 hertz, which is way beyond anything that you can hear. So what winds up happening is you capture a lot of noise in the upper hertz range that was never there. It was never recorded, and you certainly don't want to listen to it. So we can simply cut it. We wouldn't do that for a master. I would do that for this. But there's so much more in Irene than you can possibly get any other way. It's pretty phenomenal. You could hear that was actually quite clean. Yeah, it's just amazing.
And then, wait,
Sure, please, of course.
get back to, then it gets transcribed to a paper digital or to an audio digital file.
It's to a digital file, an audio digital file. What format we send it out to really doesn't matter. We generally use a WAV format for that, but it can be written out to most anything. But WAV is what we've settled on, what Carl has settled on.
And how is it stored? What is it stored?
That's the decision for whoever owns the collection. And hopefully it's properly archived with proper duplication, following the best practices for media storage. And that's a big problem in that there isn't really good, inexpensive storage available. So it's a problem. Yeah, please. I'm glad you're awake. You said you'd fall asleep. It's not happening.
When you capture it at this resolution.
Yes. That's a good question. A 4-minute cylinder is about 4 gigabytes. And there's lots of trade-offs that go on here, and we're going to run out of time, but that's okay. Okay? There's a huge amount of trade-off between what resolution do we record this in or image this in, okay? For the size of the file it creates, the cost of time it's going to take to do it, and the cost of the storage. So what we did in the first few months of the program was we recorded all kinds of different possible configurations of the imaging and all kinds of possible configurations of the output file format, and internally we agreed that this is as good as it gets, you know, the settings that we chose. And we've had to defend that a few times to our audio archivists because what happens in audio imaging is not parallel to what you do in analog to digital audio transcription. It's not the same thing. You can't simply say the math for this produces that. It doesn't work that way. Actually, Dr. Haber is now working on a paper that best defines that relationship, and we'll, of course, make it available as he will once that work is done. But we're very happy with the sound quality that we're getting. Carnegie Hall has told us that it's comparable to what they have had some of their lacquers transcribed by analog methods, with a stylus. So we know we're on the right track. We know we're doing as well as we can with the tools we have. So we have to have that economic reality, though, that says, yes, we could spend a week on each cylinder, and we'd lose them all. Go ahead.
Okay, when he started, I know it, I asked, what would it cost? He said $3 million. I don't know about that cost. What would it look like that cost? Do you have an equivalent?
We have not as yet done the final pricing, which means figuring out exactly how long it takes. Remember, we're a nonprofit. We're pricing services at cost of labor. The hardware comes to us as a gift of IMLS. It's technically theirs, but we're not having to pay for that. We pay for the labor, the overhead of the building and whatnot, and so we have to cover those costs. But we're coming close to a conclusion of what it will cost, and it's a little bit more, but not a lot more, than the analog methods that are out there to do this. So, and as soon as you start getting into cylinders that are cracked or broken, forget it. I don't know what that's going to cost. That's just going to take time. So what you have on screen now, I cannot play you the audio. The Edison Historic Site will release that. But these are the 3 oldest known wax cylinders. They were transported to NEDCC about a month ago now. We spent 2 days working with these and a few others, and very successfully got audio from all of them. Now, having said that, 2 of them were done previously by analog methods. One of those 2 wasn't complete because the groove structure on the cylinder was kind of messed up, and the analog methods simply couldn't track it. Irene could. The 3rd one is actually a glass base with a very, very thin coat of wax. And it was so thin that just looking at it, it was going to destroy the grooves. So that had never been attempted to be transcribed. And since Irene doesn't touch anything, we didn't have that kind of a problem, and we were able to recover the sound off of that. Actually, frighteningly clear because it had never been played. I can't tell you. That'll come from the Edison site. Sorry. Yeah, you'll get an announcement from them fairly soon, I would bet. So I thought you might be interested in seeing this. This is an actual image of the grooves of a disc, an audio disc, 2-dimensional disc. And you can see that the information is encoded by lateral squiggles. All right? Now, most of the time we can get good audio from the center line of that, which is actually the bottom of the groove, which is not where a stylus would look to play audio. It would hit the side of the grooves and not actually get to the bottom. So the bottom of the groove is usually pretty clean, or pretty intact. All right? So we can from there derive very high quality audio. And you can almost see that if we have a good clean line to work with, we should get really good clean audio. Because where's the junk? There's no noise built into there. We should be able to get it pretty clean. In cases where there is no bottom groove, and that does happen for a variety of reasons, we have to pull the information off the sidewall. And that's a process that's still under development, but we're getting reasonably good results from pulling information off the sides of the grooves. This is what it looks like in 3 dimension. As Dr. Haber said in that video clip, it's confocal microscopy. And what does that mean? That means that we're using a technique where the white light is split to its spectrum from red to blue, and it's through a really bizarre lens, it's focused in different places. That difference tells us how far away that object is, that point is. So we can reconstruct 3-dimensional data by using this out-of-focus imaging technique, and it's extremely accurate. So that's how you get high-quality sound off a wax cylinder without touching it, by actually splitting the light, if you will. So I want to tell you a little bit about the timeline of the project. Again, I spoke earlier, we started in March 2013. We received the IRENE system at the end of the year. We went to Dr. Haber's lab in mid-December to learn how to assemble it, because the way the timeline was going, we were going to have to take the parts and pieces back and build it ourselves, which with a lot of help over the phone, we actually accomplished. Mason Vanderlook and I spent a week down there. Mason's our audio preservation specialist, comes out of the Belfer Archives at Syracuse. Really, he's done a remarkable job with this. We spent all of January testing and calibrating the system, and really that never stops, because we keep running into new situations that we have to kind of tweak it to do differently. We started day-to-day work in February. We're on track to finish all the pieces that we committed to do in August. And in September of this year, we will be open for receiving materials from around the country to do transcription with this system. And we're talking to potential clients for that now. Yes?
How are you assessing those? Are they just people who come to you who are willing to pay, or is it altruistic things?
Well, we can't pay for it. So it's either institutions that have internal funding for it. It's too early to have gone through a grant cycle to obtain the money, but we're encouraging institutions and entities to do that, and grant funding is available for this. There's an interest starting up in providing grant money for audio of all kinds, and certainly for IRENE, and certainly IMLS is interested in this. So.
And when you started, you could only do one at a time. Now you're able to do more than one at a time.
No, you can only do one at a time. Yeah, it's this, and we wouldn't allow it to be more than one at a time. We actually have it to where we'll image one and we'll do what we call the post-processing on a separate computer. So we're actually doing 2 things at once. But as far as physically handling cylinders, it's one at a time.
And timeline on one at a time?
It takes about an hour to do a cylinder, give or take, a little less. But by the time you actually do all the handling involved with it, we're timing it out at about an hour a cylinder. Tiny bit less on the transcription discs, but effectively it's an hour a piece. So you can see one system isn't going to save everything that's out there, We have to get it to the point where there's a demand, a need, and a justification for a second and a third and a fourth system. It's just, we can't do it with one. Thought you might be interested in seeing the actual cylinder box from one of the Ishii cylinders from the University of California. That's in the Phoebe Hearst collection up there. This is what's happening with the lacquer transcription discs. And if you've never worked with them, this is a relatively bad one, but it points out what's going on. That's just lacquer paint sprayed onto or dipped on to a piece of aluminum. And
Your ability to preserve this as well as the wax cylinders on this Irene.
that's right. That's right. Maybe I wasn't clear enough about that. Irene is three-dimensional for primarily wax cylinders, but some flat disc material is vertically cut. But most of the lacquer transcription discs are two-dimensional, meaning they're laterally cut. Okay? This process was used well into the 1950s, before the advent of magnetic tape as a primary recording medium. This was king of the hill for a long time. And the problem is the lacquer is hygroscopic. It sucks up water. When it does that, it expands. When it expands and the aluminum doesn't, it blows off the aluminum because the bond between the lacquer and the aluminum isn't all that great. It's got to go somewhere when it sucks up the water. So that's what you wind up with. Even if this doesn't happen, you can't trust that what looks like a perfectly good disc is not going to be destroyed by a stylus if you try to play it. It's questionable. You don't know. It may or it may not work. So the safest way to transcribe important media, the most important pieces in whichever collections you're caring for, is not to put it on a stylus because you do not know what's going to happen. Irene, on the other hand, won't harm it because it doesn't touch it. So this is actually an iPhone photo of our Irene system. And what you've got there is the three-dimensional camera on the left, the 2D camera on the right, and they're on the same slide system to move it back and forth, all of which is precision control for movements. It's sitting on a laboratory-grade isolation table, meaning that table eliminates virtually all the vibrations that might be happening in the building. To the left, you'll see the spindle for the cylinders, and you can kind of see it as glare, but the turntable for the discs is sitting off to the right. And that is Irene. It's not fancy, but it's incredibly sophisticated at the same time.
How much does that weigh cost?
Well, that's a questionable number. And the reason I say it's a questionable number, because the three-dimensional camera jumped dramatically in cost after ours was purchased. Carl went to buy another one weeks later, and the price was dramatically higher. I don't know how that got resolved, but our system the hardware alone for our system was north of $150,000, somewhere north of that. I don't have the exact figure in my head, but that's a reasonable benchmark for what it costs. But on top of that, add support to put it together and to calibrate it in, people to run it, on and on and on, and all of a sudden it's so expensive that it's not commercially viable for a for-profit vendor to take on. You'll just never pay it back. But I think it has a place in saving a lot of the materials that are out there. And I think it takes a place like NEDCC to take on the task of doing it. So we've got about 15 minutes. Do we have questions that are going to fill up 15 minutes, or do I force you to listen to more audio? You want to listen to more?
Yeah, but wait, let me ask another question. Has there been an assessment done on what is in the world, what is in the universe of wax cylinders and preservable documentation? So that, in essence, you have a market to know who to go to, is there somebody who's figured it out, or are you just hoping people come to you with their collection out of desperation?
The Library of Congress has done surveys to take a guess at what's out there. It's a huge number. 9 million is what I carry around. I don't know if that's high or low. It doesn't really matter. The number is so large that none of us could ever get to it. The big issue is going to be funding. Can we find the money to do this work? Because it's got to come from somewhere. We can't simply support it on our own. But there shouldn't be any trouble keeping at least our one system busy all the time. You're laughing. I agree. It's like, yeah, there's a huge amount of material out there, and every study that's been done reinforces that. We've done studies that are actually studies in progress right now to identify how much of what kind of media various institutions might have. We're doing that as a part of our understanding of how big a problem we're facing. And the results we're getting back, the preliminary results, say that there's a tremendous amount of material out there that no one really knows what to do with. Cylinders are really just the start of it. You saw on the lacquer discs that they may be in more danger than the wax cylinders. It's a little hard to say. I will say that a year ago we bought off of eBay, of course, some test material wax cylinders, all of which were intact at the time, and about a third of them are broken now, just from, we weren't careful. They've been out in normal climate, but our normal climate is controlled. So it's temperature and humidity controlled, and a third of them are broken. So they're at end of life. Yes?
Just to follow up on that, can you tell us a little bit more about how if you have any ideas about how the sort of cost modeling might work? I mean, is this something that would work as a sort of vendor model, where any large research libraries might have the funds, or you would need a grant to come to you, or is it something like a historical society or a museum that might have facilities be able to kind of get in line and afford it?
Yes, small institutions or individuals even can call us, and we will do the work. It'll be whatever we charge, which I don't know that number yet. It will not be a high number, high by what standard, but it will not be a ridiculous number. And we do have individuals that have called us up based on what they've read about Irene. We've had two very interesting media reviews of it recently. One was the Boston Globe, Sunday Above the Fold. Yes, it was a beautiful write-up that was done. And a second was the New Yorker magazine just recently had something about Irene and mentioned us in it. So we've been getting calls, and some of them are really wonderful. We had a call from someone who had a World War II recording from, I guess it was a grandparent that sent it back from overseas, and they had never listened to this. They don't know what's on it, but of course it's a cherished piece of their family history that they'd love to hear. Well, of course we'll do it. Yeah, we'll figure out what the cost is going to be. It won't be so much that it'll break the bank for anyone, and it'll just be a wonderful piece for that family. There's got to be tens of thousands of things like that out there.
Have you looked into the legal implications of copyright, of public domain, that kind of thing yet? Are you even thinking of that yet?
NEDCC owns no collections. We don't commercialize anything. It's up to the owner of the object to deal with copyright. Now, if we see an obvious violation, Like if you come to me with an LP or whatever, let's call it some sort of unknown recording of the Beatles, for example, we're not going to touch it. And we know better. But if it's clearly material that falls under this umbrella that we work on, this cultural heritage world, we're going to assume that you've done the homework to have the rights to the material. And we make that very clear that we're not there to value it, we're not there to authenticate it, we're not there to figure out who owns it. That's your job. We can't do that. But on the same token, we won't appraise anything. That's not our job. We're a nonprofit cultural heritage conservation center. And usually we're working with institutional archives, and they're very up on that sort of thing. So we can pretty much trust what comes in from most places. Any more questions? Hey, I'm not going anywhere for the rest of the day, but I am leaving in the morning. I have to be back in Andover tomorrow, on Friday, actually to talk to a conservator about broken discs and how we deal with them. Andover, Massachusetts is where NEDCC is, and that's where that Irene is located. Well, Dr. Haber's unit is in Berkeley. But yes, other than that unit, there's none in California. The only two others are in DC at the Library of Congress and in Culpeper, Virginia at the National Audiovisual Conservation Center. And there's one portable Irene, and I don't know what portable means because it's a big beast, in India someplace. So that's the Irene world. So if you want to hear this, I think you know what this is.